Well, again, we're very glad to be reassembled on another Lord's Day. We brought together as the Lord's body here in Lake County, Montana, and very thankful for Jordan accommodating me and leading different songs that are centered on our topic, our sermon topic for this morning. Our sermon will be coming from the text of John 7, verse 37. In the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried, saying, "If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink." And so our title is in line with the section that's underlined, Good News for the Thirsty. Jesus uttered forth this cry on the last and great day of this feast, the Feast of Tabernacles. This was a time of ceasing from work, and on this day it was commanded that there was to be a time of solemn assembly. And though it was quietly that Jesus had gone up to the feast, but by this time he had become the center of a vast and even intense discussion. And the reason why is because the discussion was, in fact, vast and of spiritual matters, and it was a message of tremendous importance. And thus the reason why he is having to cry out above the crowd. And that we know that in his doing of this, and the voice breaking the commotion, and as the officers that would be sent by the Pharisees will go back and tell the Pharisees and explaining why it was they did not arrest him to bring him back before the Sanhedrin, they replied that no man has ever spoke as this man. And that we find with this invitation that's being given a degree of sweetness, that in fact there is mercy and grace through this invitation to those that would hear it. And it's this statement and this invitation that's being given that we're wanting to examine and to make application for ourselves. And when we are thinking about and we consider the reason behind this invitation, why make the statement that he's making? If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. Well, part of the reason is because we've heard this before. John 4:14. While Jesus is in Samaria and speaking with the woman at Jacob's well, he mentioned to her already, "But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life." And even in the chapter before, in John 6:35, Jesus said unto them, "I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger. He that believeth on me shall never thirst." But in considering the reasoning behind this specific day, though it falls in line, it is in fact consistent with the teaching that he's been involved in doing up to this point. One reason that this is not being said, it's not being said because of the present surroundings of the people. That is clear and obvious, that Jesus is not literally talking to people that are thirsty and dying of thirst. Because Jerusalem, if you read throughout the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, Jerusalem was plentiful when it came to the supply of water. There's not a soul in the crowd that, if they desired, could not get a drink very quickly. So with that being in our view, it's an understanding that, okay, this is going beyond that physical element. He's not speaking to people that are physically thirsty. But as we discussed in our class, the reason for this invitation and in the manner in which he is making it is because of the Feast of Tabernacles. It was the feast instituted to commemorate, to remind them of the 40 years in the wilderness. And this is a prominent memory. Should have been at the forefront because it was one of the crucial elements in the experiences of Israel in this wandering about for 40 years of punishment in disobeying God. And serious people at this feast and hearing Jesus make this invitation would call to mind all the events of that period because they're constantly hearing about it. They're constantly being taught about it. And now we're at this feast where we're remembering it once again. And what they're being brought into remembrance of is the miraculous supply of water. The lesson being for them, where would the people have been? What state, what circumstances, what conditions, except that God who had turned bitter waters into sweet. And that God made springs to burst forth from a rock in the desert. And so the observers of the feast are supposed to be led to think of the intenser thirst that we all experience, and that being of the thirst of the inward man. That desire that we have of fulfilling those spiritual needs. And it is amazing how that no matter who the people are or what culture they are in, you always find them, though they do not align themselves with the true origins of mankind, but every culture, people, nation has some kind of origin story that has some being greater than them being in charge and being the producer of it. I can't remember exactly the group of people in the Pacific that have, or what chain of islands they have this idea from, but their origin story is that a palm leaf fell off of a coconut tree in Hawaii, floated out into that section of the ocean, and from that palm leaf grew their chain of islands. And somehow in the story, I just thought about it, somehow in the story a shark makes its way into the story too. But it's just, here are these people, and they have that desire in explaining their beginnings, and it has to do with some type of miraculous event going on. And what we are having to temper our thinking with is this struggle that's going on between that spiritual and inward desire while living in a material and physical world. And what we find Jesus doing with this event and this invitation that he is giving is that Jesus tried to put the truth in every possible way, in every possible package that he could think of. And the reason for this is because not everybody would be touched by this appeal of Jesus. What did not catch the experience of one could potentially catch that of another. And especially for us today, it's a difficult thing for us to grasp and being thirsty. There are some, as it is the case today, would not have been through the experiences and reflections which gave a proper feeling of the urgency and the pain of thirst. But if in all of that crowd hearing the cry of Jesus, there was but one person, and only one, who had known the agonies of thirst, of being far away in some sandy wasteland where no water was, then it's going to be worthwhile for Jesus to shout aloud so that that single man, that single person, might hear it. And with that in mind, we then have to raise the question, we have to ask ourselves, well, then how is this invitation going to attract us? Because very few of us know by own experience of what it's like being in dry and thirsty lands. In our modern time of turning on water anytime that we wish, we may sometimes have been inconvenienced a little bit, but that's no sufficient experience of thirst which lasts only for an hour or two. And even as we put ourselves through difficult situations willingly, in putting the sermon together and trying to think about times where I was thirsty and thinking about working in Texas with my granddad or being overseas on the island doing different things, and it's a little bit more, when I think about that, it's a little bit more difficult finding water considering you're surrounded by an ocean and it's nothing but salt water. But then even thinking about us going hiking in the mountains and having to cross shale in the blistering heat of summer, and with that minor inconvenience, you begin to understand just how precious water is. And that having gone up into the mud lakes a couple of times and knowing here's where we're going to stop and get water, as we're preparing to cross that shale, everybody knows, it's time to refill. Because you don't want to start going across at that point and not have anything on the other side. But even with that, that doesn't compare to what we're trying to picture with a wandering in the wilderness. 40 years. And you're moving from spot to spot in a desert place. And even reading accounts of some shipwrecks, we may gather a little bit of the feeling of just the desperate desire to just have one drop. It was Coleridge that put it in this fashion in writing The Ancient Mariner, when he writes of those that are shipwrecked, and it says, and he wrote, "Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink." And to just think how maddening that would be. That here you are, thirsty, and there's water all around you, but you can't use it. And what we're being taught, what they were being taught, and what we're being taught, is that all of the physical wants that man can feel, none of those wants that we have is capable of being raised to such a degree of intensity as the want of water when you're thirsty. So down underneath the figure Jesus employs, there is a suggestion of the terrible suffering that some have to undergo in finding spiritual truth and peace. Just imagine how awful it would have to be to wander through a desert without the refreshment of water, but having to do that so as to reach whatever it is on the other side. And that is being presented for us as a picture of just life in general. Why was it the children of Israel having to wander in the wilderness 40 years? They were trying to make it to the land of Canaan. They had to suffer that. They had to endure that so as to be able to gain the peace that was on the other side. And then you have Christians being described in the New Testament that we are pilgrims and strangers in this land. That as Abraham was a man who lived in tents, and everywhere that he went and everywhere that God placed him, Abraham had to dig a well, searching for water. And that's just the way life goes. And so as few know fully the suffering of bodily thirst, it's even the case that few know the full suffering of spiritual thirst. And this is what Jesus is trying to get across to his audience in John chapter 7, and even possibly what he's trying to get across to us. That with the children of Israel, even though they had God's law, and they had God's system, and they had God's ceremonies like this feast, he's trying to point out to them, you're still not satisfied. That you're still suffering. The picture is presented time and time again throughout the New Testament that Jesus saw the children of Israel as lost sheep, scattered without a shepherd. And one of the jobs that a shepherd has is to lead the flock to water. He's pointing to them, your system has misled you. Your system has misguided you. And you're wandering out here thirsty, but I can provide for you. Few know such a state of heart as would warrant them in saying that their souls thirst for God. Few would know the way of agony is the way that some must travel before they can be filled with the fullness of God. And that's what happened to Israel in the Old Testament. They could have gone in, they could have entered into that promised land not knowing the suffering of wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But sometimes the best teacher in life is the school of hard knocks. It's enduring and going through the sufferings that you're then truly able to appreciate the goodness of God. Now, of course, for some, this difficulty is brought on themselves willingly. But then there are other times where we may step back and we may even consider, much like with the apostles in their walk with Christ, is this a testing of our faith? To know what it's like to go without, and then to truly appreciate the provisions that God makes. And then being able to empathize and sympathize with others who will face similar trials. All of these events were designed so as to trigger memories. Remember how frightening it would be to hear you're wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. But then, to let that frightening feeling subside to the reality that even with this difficulty, God is going to provide. He's not just going to leave you out there. But Israel had forgotten these lessons. They had allowed themselves, as sheep, lost and scattered, to wander further and further and further away from their shepherd. And then here is Jesus saying, it's like a shepherd shouting for its sheep, come back. Here's what you need. Here's your food. Here's your water. And he shouts to the crowd, all that thirst, come unto me. And so as we think about the applications to this, there are many things that say to us today, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. There are many things out here that draw people away to where they think, well, if I can go towards this pool, then I'll find satisfaction. And we discussed some of these in our class. The rich young ruler, his watering hole was covetousness. The parable of the rich man that had so many goods that his current barns could not store it all, and he had to tear down his barns and build bigger ones. That's where they would try and go to drink and to find satisfaction. But as we studied, or as we mentioned with the rich young ruler, he wasn't satisfied. He came to Jesus asking, what am I needing? You take, for example, the woman at the well. Her drinking well was in lust of the flesh. 5 different husbands. And yet, in discussing and studying with Jesus at the well, even she was realizing there's something else that I'm needing. That doesn't satisfy. They go to these pools, they try and drink, and find their thirst unquenched. And in fact, intensified. And that for too long, they've been parched of thirst and unable to quench it. Too long, they've been starving to death, and they haven't died. What we're discussing is a slow and agonizing death, both physically and spiritually. They are very similar to Lot choosing the well-watered plains that were next to Sodom and Gomorrah. Looking at the physical and not thinking about the spiritual and the detriment that comes from going after those things. But life is made up of this journey. Whereas we go along, we may find ourselves at places that are natural elims, as described in Exodus 15:27. And they came to Elim, where were 12 wells of water, and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the waters. As we go through our Christian life and our Christian walk, we find ourselves in positions like this. Everything's fine. Everything is well watered, everything is maintained. We're being provided for, we're being cared for. But what would we do if our Elims were to turn into Maras? Exodus 15:23, when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore the name of it was called Marah. Where do we turn? What are we to do in these moments? What if the rushing stream dries away to a few tantalizing and useless drops, and now we find ourselves thirsty? Well, we turn to the same place that they did in the Old Testament, and as what Jesus invited on the great day of the feast. If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink. We come to God. There's no other source of refreshing. There's no other place of provision. There is nowhere else that we could go in this world to have our needs met, and that being the needs of our souls. What's being presented to this crowd and what's being presented to people today is that Jesus is the only way. And we studied in our class what it means, what Jesus is implying when he states to them, "Come unto me." It's the same thing as saying, "Follow me, believe in me, or obey me." And that the drink that's being given is being given freely. And how fitting it is that he would use water in his invitation here. And then we find what the invitation is going to be before he leaves this world. Mark 16:15 and 16, he said unto them, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel," the good news, "to every creature." You go tell this good news to those that are thirsty, of every nation, of every population, of every people. Well, what's the good news? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believeth not shall be damned. The good news for the thirsty always includes water. And so we continue to extend the Lord's invitation to those that are in need of it today. The lost sinner without hope that's out in a dry and thirsty land, that if you will hear this gospel and hear this invitation, believe in this message and believe in who he is and being the Christ, be willing to repent of a past life of sins and wanting to turn from sin and to turn to Christ, to confess with the mouth that Jesus is the Christ, to be baptized in water for the remission of sins, Mark 16:16, Acts 2:38, then you'll be added into Christ, into his body, into his church. You will be a saved person, and to be in Christ is to be in the source of this living water that he offers freely. So this good news for the thirsty is for those that are out in the world, but as we discussed last week, that term does not just apply to those that are heathens, idolaters, and have never come to God. But that as Jesus was bringing testimony against the world and that the works thereof were evil, it was for the religious people of his day, and so this sermon is also for us. That as we follow God, as Old Testament Israel did, we too get thirsty on this travel. That we also go through lands that are barren, empty, and face constant drought. And that it's in those times that we must then return to the only source of life. To not be enticed by the different pools that may be out there trying to draw us in and to say, come and drink here. And to give in to those desires of the flesh. But that we will return to the one source, that one pool, to drink freely of that water for life everlasting. So this cry, if any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink, is for us. And so we invite, just as the Lord did on this feast, if anyone's in need of obedience to the gospel for the first time, having their sins forgiven, to become a Christian, we can assist you with that. Or with those of us that are Christians and walking through this life, growing wearied, growing tired, and finding ourselves thirsting spiritually, there's always an opportunity of refreshing and a time of encouraging. And so we offer this at this time as we stand and as we sing.